Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our fifth Welcome Table Talk, proudly hosted by Wintergreen Women Writers Collective in partnership with Torch Literary Arts. My name is Mayron Price, and I'm the project coordinator for the Wintergreen Women Writers Collective. Wintergreen is a 501c3 nonprofit that gathers Black women writers in literary community that seeks to publish, document, preserve, and celebrate their creative work. More than 70 women from all over the country have taken part in one or more of Wintergreen retreats or programs over the last 39 years, coming to a place where they can do the sacred work of literary and cultural production. Wintergreen women are prefiguring a world where the history and legacy of Black women writers are honored and preserved, a world where Black women writers have access to interspaces where, in community and mutuality, they can nurture one another and locate resources to support their creative practice. Today's conversation centers questions such as, what does it mean to be fed and nourished by, and to feed and nourish literary community? What responsibilities do writers bear towards place, the lands that have fed and grown them? And how is diasporic identity, particularly Caribbean identity, tied to this responsibility to the land? I think you'll agree that we've convened a stellar gathering of women writers to explore these questions this afternoon. To get us started, I have the honor of introducing our moderator for the conversation, Carmin Wong. Carmin Wong is a Guyanese-born poet, organizer, playwright, and dual-title PhD candidate in English literature and African American and diaspora studies at Pennsylvania State University. She is the inaugural Poet Laureate of State College, Pennsylvania for the 2025 to 2027 term. Rooted in Black feminist praxis and a Caribbean diasporic sensibility, Carmin's work explores the intersections of oral and written poetries, with particular attention to Black liberation movements across the long 20th century. Carmin is co-author of the choreo poems A Chorus Within Her and What Does Purple Sound Like? And playwright of Finding Home, Adeline Lawson Graham, which centers 19th century free Black Pennsylvanians. Carmin's poetry has been recognized by the Academy of American Poets and featured in a number of journals and on public radio. A recipient of multiple artist grants and fellowships, Carmin also teaches poetry to justice-impacted students across jails, prisons, and juvenile detention centers, as well as in K-12 schools, college classrooms, and community programs. The whole team at Wintergreen is so grateful for this partnership with Torch, and we're looking forward to many more exciting conversations that we hope all of you will join us for. So without further ado, please welcome our moderator, Carmin Wong.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending, of course, on when you are joining us and where you are joining us from today. We are so grateful and happy to have you with us on this Saturday, and welcome. Thank you, Mayron, for that kind introduction, and to all the Black women behind the scenes, from the Wintergreen Women Writers Collective to Torch Literary Arts, and all the people who made this gathering possible. Before we turn to and hear from Shauna and Malika, two incredible, enchanting Black women storytellers, writers, architects of language and of spirit, let me set the stage for today's unfolding discussion. Land, language, lineage, ritual, memory, poetry. These are all forms of inheritance. Across their distinct voices and Caribbean diasporic poetics, Shauna Morgan and Malika Booker return to themes and ideas of inheritances again and again, not simply to preserve what has been passed down, but to reimagine it, stretch its possibilities, and cultivate something new from it. Their poetry asks us and asks of us what it means not simply to receive all that we have been given or been left with, but to tend to it, to preserve it, to question it, to compost it, to cultivate it into something that can sustain for those who come after us. Perhaps that's where today's titles, Parable and Provisions, Feeding the Soil and the Soul, begins. not with answers, but with an invitation to think about soil as more than land, provision as more than sustenance, and poetry as a practice of tending what history, migration, memory, and community have entrusted to us and in us. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome into this space, into our space, two extraordinary poets whose work continues to expand the possibility of Black women's Caribbean and diasporic poetics. So let me introduce them. Shauna Morgan is a poet, scholar, and associate professor of creative writing and Africana literature at the University of Kentucky. Her critical work has been published in Journal of Postcolonial Writing, South Atlantic Review, and elsewhere. Her poetry has appeared in A Gathering Together, Interviewing the Caribbean, a literary field guide to Southern Appalachia, among other periodicals and anthologies. Her debut collection, Ground Provisions, was shortlisted for the Bocas Prize for Caribbean Poetry. An urban gardener, Shauna tends a hopeful provision ground at her home in the East End Artists Village in Lexington. And she continues to explore the environmental and cultural linkages between her rural Jamaican upbringing and her U.S. Kentucky life. Also, we have Malika Booker, who is a lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, a British poet of Guyanese and Grenadian parentage, and co-founder of Malika's Poetry Kitchen, a writers collective. The anthology Too Young, Too Black, Too Different, Poems from Malika's Poetry Kitchen was recently published to celebrate Malika's Poetry Kitchen's 20th year anniversary. Her pamphlet, Breadfruit, received a Poetry Society recommendation, and her poetry collection, Pepper Seed, was shortlisted for the Bocas Prize and the Seamus Hanley Center 2014 Prize for First Full Collection. She is published with the poet Sharon Alls and Morrison Shire in the Penguin Modern Poet Series 3, Your Family, Your Body. Booker and Shara McCullen recently co-edited the issue of Stand Journal, curating an anthology of poems by African American, Black, British, and Caribbean women and identifying writers. Booker currently hosts and curates People Tree Press's literary podcast, New Caribbean Voices. And if that is not enough, Booker is a Cave Canem Fellow, an inaugural poet in residence at the Royal Shakespeare Company. Malika was awarded the Chumley Award for Outstanding Contribution to Poetry and elected a Royal Society of Literature Fellow. Her poem, The Little Miracles, commissioned by and published in Magma, won the full Best Single Poem in 2020. Her poem, Libation, published in Poetry Review, won the Ford Prize for Best Single Poem in 2023. Both Shauna and Malika's writing has nourished generations of poets, including myself. And I am deeply honored and excited and gratified to be in conversation with them today. Please join me in giving them a heartfelt welcome to Shauna Morgan and Malika Booker, who will begin with offering a poetry meditation.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here. So glad to be here with you. Thanks to Torch, to Wintergreen, women writers, Carmin, and I'm just so pleased to be here with my sister Malika. Ground provisions. At a corner, some obtuse angle rendering earth to land to property. We work a plot of reckoning, sowing for sustenance instead of sale. The yam, ancestral return, yellow flesh sticky with survival, roasts on the wood fire, crackling brown to black skin, a dry aliment, spirit food for mouth and mind. When time for Niam, we close our eyes, gather the scent, scorched and savory, the textures of freedom and love, grandmother root food. The children sit around a hill of gungo peas, sing to lead the shelling and sorting. Mama ambles over, eyes gray with a bondage of memory, her pipe all puff and defiance. She teases them away to the river for janga. A diver emerges with 2 baskets full, prawn antenna seeking their place. His nakedness tickles out the children's giggles. Between smoke and water, the old woman says, "A god flesh and bakra clot." A divine silence falls, leaving only the hush of stream and breeze as they return in line to the parcel of rock and clay. An iron pot has joined the ground provisions. Inside, a swirl of leaf and pepper awaits the impatient river shrimp. Baba sees a need, and Nancy-like and rooted shallow. The cassava reaches from beneath the soil, its star-spread legs eager for a mound, a ceremony of dirt. On the other side of the harvest, we will pound fufu in burro beet, steam garden eggs, watch their flesh soften to seeded generosity. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, happy to torch, happy to everyone. I have just realized what I'm going to read. I'm going to read in response to you, Shauna. This poem is called Are Women at Funerals versus the Domino Installation. And it's in conversation with 2 Caribbean poets. It uses a line, "The women breathing like a black apostrophe to pain" by Dennis Scott. And it uses the line, "Held him the way Caribbean woman does rise his son with a drumbeat pon him back" by Jean Bintabreeze. Are Women at Funerals versus the Domino Installation. It is always women, as if they're the holders of culture, the archivists, who can tell you what hymns to sing and what happens on each day, who are industrious in the kitchen, cooking rice and peas, saltfish cakes, slicing bread, baking cake, seasoning chicken, and rocking babies, whilst our men mostly sit around the table like an installation, fingers curled around ivory dominoes. Regularly, one would push back his chair, stand back, step back to slap his last domino down with might, bouncing the table's load with his winning shot, then sit to shuffle the pack to deal again with much old talk, throats arched to knock back hard rum, while chatting old-time stories about the dead. How as they sit, my aunties, like invisible worker bees, replenish empty bottles, exchange dirty glasses, and refill saucers with sweet bricks biscuits. Heaped food will magically appear in front of each man, even in dead house, making him feel like a king in a country that only wants to see a beast in him. These women are a black apostrophe to pain. See how they contain, hold on, passed on, hold in, know what is expected, how to bathe the body, dress the dead like they're alive so they leave this world with dignity. How they contain, feeding and feeding those bodies in grief. They are our institutions. The way they curve and curve bodies like small brackets. She tells me how she curved her back to help her boy when grief dragged him down in her front room, his first funeral service, and how it hit him snot and eye water hard. Held him the way Caribbean woman does Raish's son with a drumbeat upon him back. Held him as he bawled, rocked this big man she brought into the world like the baby she cradled at birth, and she contained, she shushed, rubbed his back, patted, contained. These women are our breath, our oxygen, vital for our survival. These proud, upright spines, how they crack and straighten under all this lead, dead weight. Thank you.
Ooh. Oh my goodness, thank you both for sharing. I want us to first digest what we have heard. Those poems are really deep. Of course, I have some questions that will navigate our conversation, but I would like for us to respond to each other and certainly respond to what we have heard. I want to first begin with thinking a little bit about the poems that you have shared with us. If you could tell us how they were conceived, maybe even why you decided to begin there, right? Because Shauna, you quite literally fed us, right, with the title poem of your debut collection. And then Malika, you take us through in our women at funerals versus the domino installation. You take us through this idea of community centered around the reverence for women, right? And their roles both visible and invisible. And I want to know why begin there, right? Why begin today's discussion there, but also um, in your process of being age, right? What was it like in conceiving those pieces?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Carmen. And I really love how we're talking to each other already. Malika, I mean, the title poem, Ground Provisions, was probably one of the last poems written for this collection, but certainly the notion of it, the idea of it, I think shapes the entire collection. And of course, Ground Provisions, right, comes from the term that we use to describe those staple, tuber foods like cassava, yam, dasheen, sweet potato, right? That would be grown historically, right, in the provision ground where, enslaved people in the Caribbean, in the American South, right, would grow something that was distinctly different, right, from the enslavers' sort of monoculture farm, right? Things to subsist, things to sustain. And I think that is something that continues to resonate with me as I think about how we sustain ourselves, how we continue to nurture and heal ourselves in times of abject horror, right? And this is, we're in a moment like that. And so, all of that, I think, is anchored there. But I specifically wanted to tie it to this grandmother figure, right, as a sustaining force for all these familial connections, right, communal connections, be they the children or the diver or the other grandparent, and the woman is a sustaining force in that, and I think that of course Malika's poem speaks to that sustaining force as well.
Mhm. I think right up until Shauna read, I had several poems that I couldn't decide which I wanted to read. But as soon as Shauna started reading, I realized that Our Women at Funerals versus the Domino Installation was the right poem to read in response and in conversation. So the poem was commissioned by Magazine, and it's a special that they do every year where they ask a poet to respond to a poet that they love, so they can be in conversation and in tribute. And being Libra, I couldn't make up my mind between Jean Breeze and Dennis Scott. So I got in touch and said, I need to use all two. So the quotes that I quoted they're kind of like the idea, the genesis of the poem. And I think I started to think about, I'm always thinking about how in action, the Caribbean is very much a matriarchal society. But with laws, rules of the society, it's very patriarchal. And so I wanted to really address that, and kind of and that invisibility, but that vitalness. And I think it's the way that Dennis Scott said, "All women are a black apostrophe to pain." And I wanted to really explore that in the poem. And then this idea of Jean Breeze line with the woman holding the child, which for me sees this curved body, and thinking about, I mean, it's not in the poem, but thinking about the shapes we make as women, within our society, and how that shape is constructed and deconstructed, is revered and despised. But what mighty work it does in the background. So I wanted to give tribute to that.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. And actually, since you mentioned folks like Dennis Scott and also Jean Brinton Breeze, right? A dub poet, which I'm just fascinated with, right? I think we have to talk a little bit about the influences that shape your work, in your collection, Ground Provision, Shauna, and even in Pepper Seed, Malika. You both begin with these epigraphs by, folks like Lorna Goodison, right? So there is this way of returning to the past and walking in the path of writers who have come before you, so to speak. So, I want us to think a little bit about the legacy in which this work unfolds from, and the language that takes shape because of it. Both of your works deeply engage with Caribbean speech, English variations, rhythm, oral traditions, ancestral voices. And certainly it makes us consider the ways that English itself carries histories of power. And so, I want to ask you, how do you think about language in your writing as both an inheritance and as a site of struggle? How do you use language that was handed down to you while also reshaping it, challenging it, or making room for voices that dominant narratives have often excluded, right? And you talked a little bit, Malika, about wanting to center women's voices, women's identities in there. I think that's one way of doing it. But if you can expand a little bit on that, thinking a little bit about accessibility, language, and those influences that show up in your writing.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, in that poem, Ground Provisions, there's this line, a God flesh bakra clot. Something my grandmother used to say, God flesh being, God's flesh, our bodies essentially, and sort of the divinity of that. And bakra cloth being, the master's cloth, which is covering this divinity, right? That's something that we can take off, something we can remove, something that is not sort of inherent to who we are. And that kind of nuance I think about with language as well. In Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in the book Something Torn and New, An African Renaissance, talks about the site of the African Renaissance as the Caribbean, as Haiti specifically, talks about language and linguistic innovations in the diaspora, right, as being the sort of driving force for the African Renaissance, right? And, we have innumerable examples of that, right? Of what we do with language, not just its innovation, right? But the dynamic ways that language helps us to resist, and the writers who influence me are these, just wonderful examples of that kind of linguistic innovation, linguistic incursions, even, right? Certainly Lorna Goodison, right? And there's a way that Lorna Goodison deals with music and language and the land that shapes me, as does, someone like Lucille Clifton as well. And so, certainly those two Black women writers shape so much of my work. I think Lucille Clifton, I always say, has a poem for every day and every moment, you know. But in terms of sort of language and what they do with language and how that shapes how we think about ourselves and the possibility for what we can do, is something that I'm sort of constantly thinking about in my own work. And of course, I speak, different languages, English, Jamaican patois, Jamaican language, African American vernacular English, and some of the other colonial languages. But always, I'm thinking about what I can do in the world of a poem to connect us to to this legacy, to this lineage, of resistance and possibility?
I think I agree heartily with so much of what Shauna says. I think one of the things that I am always excited by, growing up in Guyana until I was 11, being born in England and going back to England. And then kind of going on holiday to visit my mother and my father in my mother, and then she moved to Brooklyn. So going to visit her in Brooklyn. And Brooklyn, for some reason, my whole childhood of visiting Brooklyn, Brooklyn was just Caribbean, Flatbush Avenue. But the multitude of accents. And I know I'd be listening to kind of like the musicality. I would start to get the flavor for me, like a Trinidadian and a Guyanese and a Grenadian accent. It's the different musical flow. One has bass. To me, the Jamaican accent has bass. The Trinidad is such a lyrical kind of almost soprano-like. It's very lyrical. So I've always been listening to the musicality of the language of these different, particularly when I'm in Brooklyn, interacting with Guyanese relatives and Grenadian relatives. And then in England, my aunt would say, as soon as you come in, you shut that front door, you're in Grenada. So this notion of growing up in being outside in England with English kind of classmates and going to an English school, but coming back and shutting the door, and it's completely Grenadian, as if no one lives in England. The food is Grenadian, the language is Grenadian, the stories being told is Grenadian, the phone calls coming in is Grenadian, the punishment phone calls, you did something wrong. And so all the phone calls, every phone call, my aunt's gonna start with what I did, and then the aunt in Canada or the aunt in Trinidad or the aunt in the uncle in Guyana is gonna tell you off, right? And the way we switch, so the way my aunt would answer the phone, hello, and then realize it's someone Caribbean and just switch. I've always been interested in that, and I think poetry gives me the space to be able to explore the way we navigate as Caribbean bodies and Caribbean diaspora bodies, all these kind of languages that we hold inside us, but also the way within even our own society, the language is kind of ridiculed. So the whole population speak with an accent, but standard English, so supposedly standard English is the hierarchy, and I wanted to just explore that. So there's that. And then in response to your other question, I think I was an avid reader, and I was coming of age at a time when women, both in America, Black American writers and Caribbean writers, were beginning to become into prominence and coming into their own. So, Shange, Goodison, Jean Buffon, Mel Collins. There's such a list, Nikki Giovanni. There's such a list of writers that really shaped me, and that I'm in conversation with, but also that I judge my writing by. Like I want my writing to make them proud. So when I'm writing, I want it to be of a quality and standard that, that Lorna Goodison or that Shange would look at, or even Morrison would look at and say, yeah, this girl's coming to come. So it's not only writing in response to them, but writing aspiring, writing to help them keep me at a high standard, keep my standard and my demands of myself really high, I would say. And Jean Binta Breeze, I'm still mourning her death. She was a friend, but she was also such a beautiful, amazing poet. There's no a tour de force, a person of our own stature. And so I just feel like I want to always be keeping her name alive in my poetry, in my writing.
I love this idea too of that purposeful writing in conversation with these folks who have shaped us in such profound ways, Malika. And that responsibility to to make them proud and to stand in that lineage, right? To do the work that they started, some component of it, right? I think is just an incredible responsibility and also an honor. Yeah, I love that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for filling the space with the name of these writers and remembrances, because I think that the arc of both of your work are thinking certainly about these traditions in which we have been planted in and in which we take up and continue to cultivate in those ways. And because, Malika, you talked to us a little bit about the politics of linguistic identity in the Caribbean. And then, Shauna, as I was listening to your response, you quite literally asked, how do we think about ourselves, right? I want us to talk a little bit about our identities as Caribbean women writers. Both of you write from positions complicate national boundaries. Caribbean writers in diaspora writing about Guyana, Jamaica, Grenada, the UK, United States, and beyond. And your works remind us that Caribbean literature has never been contained by geography, right? And I want to emphasize that because I think it's important for those who are tuning in to better understand what we mean when we talk about what exactly is Caribbean literature, right? What exactly is the Caribbean literary imagination, if you will. So with that, I ask, what possibilities emerge when Caribbean identity is understood not as a fixed location, but as movement, as memory, and or as a way of seeing. I think that maybe we can first start with problematizing. Even what exactly is defined as Caribbean literature? Do you hold on to the title of Caribbean poet? Do you prefer to identify as, Caribbean American, Caribbean British? What are the nuances in that and how you show up and how you identify, and then thematically how that shows up in your writing?
So I think I walk the world as a Caribbean woman. So it's really interesting because I've spent most of my life in Britain more than, but for some reason my imagination and my critical imagination engages with the Caribbean, whether and some of the things that I address in my writing are things that were problematized for me from since I was small. I always had questions about women within the Bible. I was the person in Sunday school who was like, well, sir, like, why is she being stoned? What happened? How come both of them are not being stoned? I'm the person who was thinking, but when I was looking at Jezebel in the Bible, there isn't anything. She manipulated someone, and there's not something sexual. Yet she didn't do anything sexual. So why are we being implored in this way? I was always kind of watching what I felt with these magnificent women. I felt like the women around me were magnificent. My aunts, my grandmothers, the market women, the teachers. I just felt like they were like light. They were like chandeliers, and for me, unfortunately, from in terms of that, like my dad and them, they were like in the background slightly, but they were the pinnacles in a way. And I think I've always been trying to explore that. I was in Guyana when Walter Rodney passed away, and those things left something indelible on my was well, not passed away, was killed, was murdered by the state. And some things are profound. I went back to do some research, and in the government library there was just one A4 page in a folder with Walter Rodney. And so this notion of I think I'm always interested in all these things shaped me as a writer. This invisibility, this vibrant these vibrant people, these colors. And I think I was spending a lot of time as a writer when I was honing myself and honing my skills in a British landscape, which was all about subtlety and being being diminished and just about the language and here I am coming with these. I was thinking, how do I get these Caribbean women who are in my house and in my family? How do I get them on the page? Let me look at Toni Morrison and what she does with African American women to just see how I can get the broad, complicated women on the page. How can I deal with language? Let me look at Louise Bennett to understand how I can navigate language and colonization in reverse. I'm a person who loves reading romance books on the armchair, right? And Louise Bennett, I think, and Derek Walcott, even Kamar Braithwaite, all these poets demonstrated to us that the Caribbean is not only the Caribbean, but because of the World War and the Caribbean migration, because of Windrush and and because of Caribbean migration, Guyanese in Canada, and I met a Trinidadian in we were doing something in Azerbaijan as poets, and I heard someone say, "Oh God, boy," in the back, and I thought, "My God, there's a Trinidadian in Azerbaijan." We all gravitated to him at the end. He said he was walking down the road in Azerbaijan. He saw the poster and just hightailed it here because this happened. And I think we have to understand. So I think our poetry can't has to reflect that global internationalism. And I think I'm going to end by saying I remember Stuart Hall, who's just like, oh my God, I love Stuart Hall. But I remember Stuart Hall thinking about the Caribbean as this ultimate in postmodern, in that it's rooted in the past and the present and how it can live together at the same time. Um, um, and it's rooted in globalism because it's such a global space, but then it's such a kind of an island or islands and places and how it complicates notions of that. And I think that has to be reflected in the poetics.
Absolutely. So much to respond to here. And thank you for invoking the name of Stuart Hall. I sometimes, right, I regularly describe myself as a multi-ethnic Black woman. I am an African in the diaspora, first and foremost. And so my view is always Pan-African because my experience is distinctly Pan-African. My politics are Pan-African, right? So I'm a Black woman who's a global citizen with ties to all of the Black diaspora and the continent, right? Um, but I was born and raised in Jamaica in a community that was just so vibrant and rich in all ways, right? And that shapes so much of what I am, especially when I'm reaching back to memory to think about how to be in the world. And so much of how I understand myself as a Black woman in the world is tied to everything there, the political activism of my mother, right? My grandmother's ability to feed an entire community of people, right? um and so this idea, especially of movement, right, is for me is not limiting, it's enhancing, right? And so when, coming to the United States and growing into a distinctly Black American experience, when my parents moved to the US, we didn't move to a Caribbean enclave. We moved to a Black American community, right? And so much of who I am is also tied to that. But we know, there's a reason why Zora Neale Hurston traveled the world, right? Looking into and searching, seeking out Black people's experiences everywhere, right? Across the Caribbean, across the Americas, across the globe. I think that profound connectedness um, is always something that I hold, that I go to in my writing. And I think it's the thing that connectedness is a thing that we should hold each other with, right? I think it's enriching in so many ways. So often, we find reasons to separate ourselves, but we come from a long tradition, right, of activists, writers, Black women who reached, across the world to connect Black people. Just think about Maya Angelou in in Ghana, as one example, but there are numerous examples,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And so I always, I think it was Kwame Das who said, and I'll paraphrase very poorly here, but the prism through which he views the world, right, is an African prism. And so I think that is true for me as well. And I just, I'm nurtured by all the ways, the different locales and the different communities. I mean, even here, I'm in Lexington, Kentucky right now, and I can go 20 minutes, 30 minutes and touch Appalachia, but if I drive, to south to Alabama, it's a distinct experience. But again, we're connected in so many ways.
mm.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, you said so many names that I want to make sure that we just uplift and that we resonate with in this space, because a lot of the people that you mentioned are people who have, ultimately deeply shaped my own literary journey. And I think that a lot of who I am as a writer is shaped by being introduced to their works when I was, right? Thinking so much about Zora Neale Hurston, right? And the ways that she's actually advocating for Black language, thinking about African American vernacular English in a time in which people were not trying to publish that, right? People were not even trying to credit that. Thinking a lot about Stuart Hall, who talks about this positionality between, what it means to travel space and for our writing to travel with us. And of course, certainly about Walter Rodney. And even when I traveled abroad to Tanzania last summer, I was thinking about the visiting the university and walking the exact steps in which he would have walked when he taught here, thinking, a lot about the writing of Kwame Das and even him, being this transnational Black writer. So you take up space, right? And I think it shows in the kind of poetry and the kind of writing that you immerse us with, taking on that global international perspective that is inherently Black, right? It is a way of seeing the world, a way of being in the world. And so I want to actually turn back to something that you mentioned, Malika, in your response. You talked a little bit about the ways in which the biblical text has informed your writing and your poetry. And, I want us to think a little, or I would love for you to maybe talk to us a little bit about the ways in which your work draws on biblical language, prophecy, sermon, testimony, and not always as a way to affirm inherited scripture, but oftentimes to trouble it and to revise it and to speak back to it. So I'm curious about your relationship to the biblical language in your work. And the reason why I'm asking this is because these writers that you mentioned were formative for me, right? And so I think that in hearing you speak, I'm thinking about the ways in which we are introduced to certain textual material begins, the kind of conversation that we're having with ourselves as writers and how that translates to the page. So can you talk to us a little bit about how that shows up in your work?
Well, the project I've been working on for a number of years, everyone's like, "When are you going to finish this project?" It's finally with a publisher, and we've just spent the last 2 weeks editing, doing editorial work around the poem. So it's nearly there. So I've been looking at creolizing the King James Bible. The King James Bible, for me, it's a book that I'm fascinated. I've been fascinated with my whole life. I've been fascinated with the fact that it King James kind of commissioned this translation of this Bible, and its birth around the time of the beginning of the kind of transatlantic slavery. and the middle passage. It's used to bless the boats that come out, that were going off. But it's also used in some of the rebellions that we have, particularly if most of the rebellions that we had in the English-speaking Caribbean that I can speak of, and in Jamaica as well, I can think of two where it was the book that heralded those rebellions by Baptist priests, by Methodist believers. It is the book that is at the heart of Rasta. Into looking at it. It is embedded in reggae lyrics. You take any reggae lyrics, that Old Testament is there. I'm interested in the formation of creolized language with the Creole language and the Bible, and how the biblical language and the grammar, the African language, grammatical grammar that underlays, Minano, and stuff like that. Because people are brought to this place. I want to say so much. So I'm trying to say so much in a short amount of time with my fascination. I mean, my fascination could be a book. But how within creolization, it's formed from from trying to learn English without being taught, with the underlay of an African vernacular and grammar, and then this biblical kind of linguistic kind of language on top. But also, I'm interested in Carnival and in the Midnight Robber, who is the poetic speaker in the Carnival, and how he draws from Shakespeare and King James and Genesis. When I was born, the world shut down. It was 9 nights and this and that. And even watching, I can't remember the name of the Jamaican film now, but I remember watching it. And the bad man, he just started, I was in the Caribbean watching it, and he was talking to the guy he was speaking to who had done something bad, and he started tearing the pages of the 25th Psalm. And I remember the whole cinema going, "Oh, I'm a bad man. I'm just a tear out. He's tearing out the thing." And then he rolled a spliff with it. And the relationship with the local community, with the Bible, and all of us knowing that guy's gonna die when that spliff gets lit. So I'm interested in so much, and also in the Negro Bible, which is, when we were being given our freedom, or however, freedom. Anyway, how the landowners were so scared about the power of this Bible that they took out all these books, pertaining to the Exodus. They took out all these books pertaining to anything that would most of the Old Testament really, and left in, turn the other cheek and all that kind of stuff. But I think most importantly, I'm interested in the King James Bible, and its relationship to women, and how it's used to police women, and for me, how even the Rasta movement, which I think is one of the most radical and profound movements to come out of us as a people, because it started interrogating language itself, was at the heart of that movement, but yet still it did not interrogate language with regards to women, and that was, to me, was a big failure. So and I could go on, but those are some of the reasons that I've been fascinating with it. So the women in my collection are kind of speaking back to the Bible, but also interrogating their space, interrogating the gender violence within there. And what I found really interesting is when I was working on some of the spaces, like the Levite passage in the Bible, was during lockdown, when across the Caribbean there was all this rise in gender violence, and women being remembered. Here I was reading with this woman. So I think I asked myself, what would happen if I started to look at the Bible and creolize the King James Bible, making the characters, the geography and stuff, Caribbean? What would that yield, and what would I discover, and what would happen? And it's been a really fruitful and really interesting project.
Wow. I not just myself, I saw in the chat, I think many of us are looking forward to that collection. So please keep us posted because that is powerful. And I think that that is the kind of work that we are talking about when we talk about ideas of freedom, right? When we think about freedom practices. And so thank you so much for sharing that. Shauna, I want to ask you, your book, it moves between cultivation and prophecy, between tending what is already here and imagining what has not yet arrived. In ground provisions, gardening feels like much more than planting, watering, toiling the soil. It becomes a practice of memory at times of heartbreak and grief, of care, of learning and relearning the self. So I want to ask you, and this might be a profound question here, but I have to ask you, what does gardening ask of us that poetry also asks of us? I want to leave you with that because you did identify in your bio that you are a not just a poet and a professor of poetry, but you are a urban gardener.
Thank you for that question, Carmen. That is a big one, right? But I'm always thinking about the possibility, right, of growing and what it means to have a seed, right, and what can come from that. And it's this is a part of my inheritance, right? This is a part of my inheritance as a Black woman. My ancestors were stewards of the land, right? Um, I'm always thinking about them. Also, I'm always thinking about the land too as this like site of violence too, right? I can't think about the space without thinking about indigenousness and what that means for the land that I'm standing on, the land that I'm trying to cultivate. But I think for me, always garden. I know that there's a lot, right? That the land, the plants, the flora and the fauna, these more than human beings, right? Other than human beings there's so much that I have to learn, right? From the land. And so I feel that I'm always in communion in that regard. There's a lot of pain there, there's a lot of violence there, but there it is also a possibility. It's also a space that there are so many lessons to be learned there. And so I think my gardening practice is very connected to my writing practice. What the things that need to be sort of cut away, what I plant, the sort of patience that it requires to wait for that, right? Sometimes I feed myself from this land. Often I feed myself and others from the work that I do there, the labor that I do there. It's for me, it is always connected to my history. And so in some ways, going to my garden is like going to worship, to a kind of practice. There's praise that's happening there, right? Yeah, there's so much to think about, but I think this idea of possibility and imagination, and I often think about Robin DG Kelly's Freedom Dreams, in that book, the idea that poetry is this place of possibility that can teach us so much about how to move towards liberation, right? To the idea that liberation practice in whatever ways we see that, right? Whether we are taking to the streets, whether we are teaching somebody to read, whatever that may look like, right? That thinking about our acts of liberation in the way that, poets sort of approach possibility in the writing, that freedom is a kind of poetry practice. There's so much to be learned there. And I feel like I'm going on and on without getting to the heart of your question. But again, there is that inheritance that I have tied to how my ancestors engaged with the land, were forced to work the land, but also defied the ways that they were forced to work the land, and the possibility that can come out of that as a kind of sustaining force, I think is important to me.
Just wanted to for me, the word provision is such a profound word, right? Like, back home when someone says provision, they're talking about this ground food, but so they're going to the land to cultivate that provision that it provides. I just have such a fascination with that word provision. And so I was just taken with the book as soon as I saw the title because I thought you're going to explore it in a way. For me, I still kill plants. I don't know, something missed me. So I'm jealous there's so much poetically, politically, kind of just in terms of nurturing, in terms of diet, in terms of it's such a loaded kind of term. It's almost like an ideology in itself, that term provision. And I'm so excited by some of what you've said about it, but also I just wanted to add that it's a word in the Caribbean. Poets, we get fascinated by words and we stay with it. And I remember one of my poems where, I'm shopping with my aunt in Brixton Market and she's taking time with all the food, examining everything, and I'm dying. I'm like, do we have to haggle for the fish and stuff? But then, and I couldn't end it for a long time and working with Kwame Dawes, trying to figure out the ending. And the ending is like this is what my grandmother did in the land, kneeling in the provisions. When she dug it out, she had to look at it to evaluate. And so, yes, my aunt and all these people are not at the land, but they're at they're in the market, but they're still looking at the food in this way and thinking about how they heal us and stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of add that.
Yeah, and I think that our work as Black women writers, our work as writers is so crucial in this moment because there's a kind of feeding and nurturing for our sort of communal soul, right? And our individual souls that needs to happen, especially in like moments of grief,
Mm.
right? Paralyzing grief, in difficulties. And also there's a way that we can sort of wrap up joy in that too, right? As a kind of sustenance, as a kind of provision as well. And I feel very strongly about that in my own work.
Yes, I agree. There's so much more that I want to say, um, particularly as we talk about land and as we talk about this idea of nourishment and community, and to understand that oftentimes community is what feeds us, right? I mean, literally, but also spiritually. And so I will ask one more question before we pivot to our Q&A portion, because we want to make sure that we can hear from some of the attendees who have joined us today. So if you have a question and have not yet put it in the Q&A, please do so because we want to hear from you. And as you do that, I want to ask you, Shauna and Malika, to continue this conversation around responsibility and relationship to land. What does it mean, right? As Caribbean writers, which we've been talking about all morning, all afternoon, what does it mean to belong to a land? Is land something we possess? Is it something we remember, something we imagine or reimagine? Or is it simply something we create through language and through community?
What's really interesting, I was talking to my friend one time and I said to her, I'm going back home to visit my mom. And she said, which one? And I was like, oh, I'm going to Brooklyn. And the other day I was walking in Brooklyn, I felt so at home. I was like, I love this place. There's the man sitting playing domino. There's the Haitian people on the corner. But I feel at home, but I feel separate. I feel like it's not my home. I feel like that in Britain. I feel like that in Brixton. I'm like, this is home. This is so home, and it's not my home. I feel like that in Leeds, in Chapeltown. I feel like that in Guyana, in Georgetown. I think I feel more like that in Guyana because I grew up there from a baby until 11, right? Um, I think interestingly enough that the being an insider and an outsider is what has shaped me as a poet. Um, there's something really profound for me about knowing that brother's ba my brother's navel strings were buried in Guyana, and that I was born in England, so my navel string is not buried in the land. That's always been something really like deeply disquieting for me, and always I felt like as if this is why I have all these places at home because the navel string hasn't been buried there. But there's this really interesting, so I think home and land are really interesting to me. That I love all these places for different elements of them. And I suppose at the heart of them, I suppose Brixton, Chapeltown, Brooklyn, Port of Spain, Georgetown, St. George's, or Victoria, Grenada. At the heart of them is the people and my family populate these places, this larger Caribbean diasporic community. And it feels as if wherever they live, I feel at home. I find it really difficult. I'm always like, one of my friends and I was speaking about where I decided to live in Leeds. When I came here, all the estate agents were taking to me to all these places that were populated by mostly white population. And I was like, I can't live here. I need to live where there's a large black population. So I came back to Chapeltown, and there's something grounding for me when I go anywhere and I come back and I just see a lot of black bodies walking. That's interesting to me. So I'm grappling with and thinking about this notion of land and home and navel string and burial and land in terms of your family leaving land for you in the Caribbean, and what does that mean? Um, and how important that land is because they had to work for that land, because that land, and what does it mean to live and work on a land that was part of a land that 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 was cruel to you? What is the impact of that? So I'm always grappling with that in my work and in my thoughts. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't have an answer, but those are the way I grapple with it, I think.
Mhm. Grappling, I think that's such an ideal, a perfect word right now. And Malika, so much of what you've said also resonates with me. This idea of being at home in many places at the same time, not entirely at home. You know, my navel string is buried under the root of an asteroid in Wrong, Clarendon, but that place has not been home for me in 40 years, you know? And so I feel a profound connection, but I feel rootedness in many places. And I think you're right that there's something about people and connecting to community that forms a home, you know? I mean, I think many people own land, right? And the governing laws of our respective locales tell us that we can own land. When in truth, I mean, I think we belong to the place. The place doesn't belong to us, right? So I'll pause there because I know we have lots of questions.
Thank you. I want you to know that the chat is saying that they feel nourished by your answers. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to remind everyone who is tuned in to make sure you are looking at the chat where you can find the links to both Shauna and Malika's collections, and also the links where you can learn a little bit more about the Wintergreen Women Writers Collective and Torch Literary Arts. So I want to transition with the time that we have left to answer some questions that have been pouring in. The first one comes from Tiffany Caesar, who asks, and I'm gonna say this because there's multiple parts. What is the medicinal and spiritual contributions of your work to your own lives? Is there ever an internal battle concerning if your work is, quote, too much to share? Is there ever a time when you feel the need to separate your creativity from various areas of your life due to colonial, traditional, and or capitalistic value systems, which I think you were getting at a little bit at the end, Shauna? A few things all at once, but Tiffany asked, please answer what resonates the most with you. I'm happy to repeat any parts of that as well.
I don't think I can ever separate my creative self from anything that I do in the world. It is how I move and live in the world. My poet self is my teacher self, is my mother self, is my sister self, and so on. And it shapes everything. Right. But I think there are moments too with the writing where you are troubled or, ask questions. And I think, sort of going back to the kind of medicinal, spiritual aspect, I was invited to write a memorial poem for Breonna Taylor, who was murdered in her apartment in Louisville, just about an hour and 15 minutes away from here, and I was asked to write a memorial poem, by the Kentucky Black Writers Collaborative. And I felt that it was something just too vast, too burdensome, too heavy, right? That there were no words that could capture. But I challenged myself and I leaned in, and I did go to the land, to her mother, to her role as a nurse, to song, to Black music, to our traditions of growing and sustaining and resisting. And so I think that in many ways, some of the things that are most unsettling, that are most troubling, that are most heartbreaking, I think my work as a writer, I see myself as sort of having a responsibility to navigate that, to offer something that will be a comfort, a medicine, a bearing witness even, right, to the violence, while at the same time sort of showing a path forward. And so yeah, I think that's just, just to take one piece of that question. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you for that question. I think work is a way for me to think things through. And thinking doesn't sometimes only involve the mind. Sometimes it involves the soul. Sometimes it involves religion. Sometimes it's thinking through, is litany appropriate here? Sometimes it's thinking through, it's pushing beyond the pat answer. Sometimes it's pushing into places where I am in grief. I am rocking at that desk, but pushing through to find self there. So I think my poetry does so much for me in the space of writing. Sometimes I am navigating some difficulty in how to find the language to put to write this down. That's not pat. That's not. I think sometimes I have to work really hard within it. But I don't think about. I think about the construction and the creation of the poem as me navigating whatever. Each poem is different, whatever that poem demands, and trying to grapple with it and sometimes discard it, as the case may be. In terms of capitalism, that comes, I suppose those things come after the book, when the book is coming out and stuff like that. And those poems have been written. It's not, I don't think about that in itself. I just think, as a writer who didn't have access to Black writers for a long time, I want my kind of my Oscar would be that some Black girl in a playground gets my work and feels nourished like I did. That's the Oscar that I work for, really.
Thank you. We have another question from Natalie, for Shauna, who asks, have you always been a gardener? When you really started to play more and grow, did you feel any shift in your writing, or can you speak more about how it influences your writing? I recently broke through my inability to grow things. I would kill them, but my garden is flourishing now and brings me so much joy and pride and realization at how much of that connection feels like a luxury now when it really should belong to all of us.
Thank you for that, Natalie. And my experience was similar. I mean, I grew up in a farming community with people. My aunt could grow just acres and acres of gungo peas, and everyone. Um, but when I came into adulthood in the US, I realized that I was always killing plants too, Malika, and I struggled with that and didn't see myself initially in that lineage of women, but had a breakthrough as well. And it is just deeply empowering, right? To be able to sort of nurture something, to plant a seed, to see what the earth does, and to do your part by watering or weeding or whatever it is, right? And yeah, I think it changed. Certainly changed my writing. I've always engaged the natural world, but the sort of the process, right, and the possibility opened up so much for me. And yeah, I think that has become a sustaining force for me as a writer. And I think that, when I hear someone say, "Oh, I don't have a green thumb," I'm like, well, you just wait, just try. The possibility is there. Keep pressing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that response. I'm going to, for the sake of time, and because these questions connect, I'm going to put these two questions, one by Denham Fisher and another one that was submitted to us together. And I'm going to ask first to you, Malika, could you speak to your archival research and community as medicine or encouragement for your literary work? And then I want to also add to that another question that asks, how do you tune into capturing that feeling of inclusiveness or longing? Thinking a little bit about the lack thereof belonging that can show up in your daily lives as people who are part of the Caribbean diaspora and understand home as sometimes elsewhere.
Mhm. I'm going to answer that quickly by saying the thing that grounds me wherever I am is carnival. So I'm a carnivalist, which means that, so like everybody knows that in August I'm going to disappear. Like I am going to disappear for Notting Hill Carnival. I'm going to Grenada Carnival as well. So I'm going to disappear for the whole of August. I think there's two loves in my life, poetry, literature. That's on one hand, and carnival on the other. And carnival is a spiritual thing. It heals me. It makes me feel glamorous and beautiful. When you're walking in Juve morning, you feel like the ancestors are there and they're with you. You understand this is a space of resistance. So every year, there's this knowledge and this notion of healing, of being with my big Caribbean community that nourishes me as a writer and nourishes who I am. In terms of myself and in terms of belonging, I think what I've been lucky to do from since the onset of writing is to cultivate community around me. So every day I'm in conversation with Roger Robinson, with Karen McCarthy Wolf, with Denise Saul, with various people. Jason Allen Pisson just lives up the road, Khadija Ibrahim. And these people, we share writing, and I think at the beginning of our career, when Kwame Dawes talks a lot about this, when it was so hostile to Black British writers, and we're still constantly being erased. Two of the courses, the only courses that are teach Black British poetry, have just shut down. I think we've always had each other to kind of shoulder the blame, and we also realize that we're writing for a larger global community and global family. So Britain has never been able to, that's crab versus crab identity or notion has never kind of phased me, because I think carnival is so big and global, and my community, Jason, Alan Pissot, Roger Robinson, Karen McCarthy, Wolf Warsan, all these communities are so global and so big that they enable us not to try and belong in this kind of small literary landscape. And I'm so blessed and so happy for it. And also just Torch, Furious Flower, Carve Carnum, just reaching out to all these, working with Kwame Dawes, reaching out to all these kind of global conversations across the diaspora has been really helpful to me. I feel like I belong. I feel like, Shauna or Lauren Elaine, they're my family, they're my sisters. Kwame Dawes is my brother. So I have this huge kind of family that makes me feel that I belong.
I would have to agree with that. The community is so important, and I've only been in Lexington for six, I guess going on 7 years now. And I was really very fortunate to find a nurturing community here in, an organization called Bloodroot Inc. Although at the time they were not an organization, but a group of women who said we want to bring people together, writing what is and just come together and write and share words. And it was such a crucial force for survival here, and all of those, there are innumerable. Some of the names we know very well, Torch and Wintergreen and Furious Flower, right? And some of them we have not heard yet, but they are in your communities, they're in our communities, they're everywhere, and can sustain us. One of the things I do here in Lexington, I grow a lot of Jamaican things. I have callaloo and scotch bonnet and okra and all these things in my yard right now that sort of connect me, to I have maypops, Kentucky maypops that are, native here, but they're similar to passion fruit. They're the same, just a different variety, right? So I try to sort of connect myself in that way, but I think that the people the
Mm.
people who hold you, who you hold as well, you share work with, you share food with, you do all of those things. Food is always at the start. You say carnival, me say food. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I want to ask one final question. Before we move on, we are coming to the end of our time together, but as you might imagine, both Malika and Shauna were really excited. And when I asked what poems you might want to open up with, they said, I also have one to close with. So I want to ask one quick question. Um, and it might not be that quick, but I would like for us to answer, hopefully with a little bit of brevity and then turn back to your work before we invite Amanda and those to close us out. So the question comes from someone who was talking a little bit about their own mental health as a writer. And they asked during times of disconnect or blockage of some sort, what do you do to reconnect yourself to the practice of writing? And I want to add to that a question that I thought about, which is what has literary community fed in you, and what responsibility do you feel to feed in it in return? Because I think all of these things are connected in that way.
I mean, it's been critical and necessary for me, I write in community with others. When I write with others, I feel a responsibility to offer something, right, to my community. And when I'm having a hard time, I go to music, I try to plant something, I listen to music, I read others, right? I try to make something, I try to create something. Um, but when I speak of community, I mean, I think um, I literally mean that the writing my community of people has been crucial for me producing this work, right? And so I always, I think being blocked is certainly something that is challenging, but always creating something or engaging any kind of creative act. If you're not writing, right? If you're just reading, just listening to music or making something, I think to help and doing that in community to push yourself through that challenging moment, I think is necessary.
Sometimes, sometimes you don't get to the desk for a long time, I find, and that's when I come back to the desk, I'm like, do I know how to write? Can I write a poem? On my desk, I surround myself with family members, and that could be family members from Sharon O's, Terrence Hales, Yehuna Amakai. I have my family there, and once I feel like sometimes it's just that the body is empty and it needs food or it needs a spark and something that, Ross Gay writes or Kwame Dawes writes or Patricia Smith writes or Patricia Smith writes or Patricia Smith writes. I mean, I just pick up Patricia Smith if I'm stuck. Means that it sparks something. So I just feel like sometimes I have to feed the muse or sometimes I have to listen to music or mostly listen to music and read and or listen or go on listen to podcasts and listen to poets or go and watch poets or and then I find that I start rocking as if I'm in church to something and I know something's happening. So I think that I kind of go to the poetics church, and it can be anything from people, a conversation like this that I would go on and get back, listen to or look at, or someone talking poetics or something like that. And also I have so much how-to books on here and exercise books. I might do some exercises and stuff like that. I find August really brilliant because I try and take part in Nicole Seeley's reading, and I find that September I'm just bursting to write, although this year I'm carnival in the whole August, so bye Nicole Seeley this year. But yeah.
Thank you. I want to
Oh,
make
sorry,
sure.
sorry. I just wanted to end by saying the other thing I find I've done is I've done a list of it's called Black Girl Altar, like a music list, and I just keep adding to it, and it has things like gospel or soca or any kind of music, and I just put it on kind of random. But sometimes you're in a difficult space in the poem. You're writing something that at the end you have to do wellness from. And I find that I just put that on and sing and, in the house or party or wind up on the chair or something like that. And that kind of that movement and stuff helps to kind of balance that out. That's the other thing I wanted to say in terms of that.
Mhm.
Absolutely. That's so necessary. I'm happy that you added that in, thinking about these grounding practices. I want to affirm the flowers that you guys have planted here and that we see blooming in real time. I'm looking at the chat and folks are writing, what this experience has been like for them, stating that it has been rejuvenating, mentioning the emotionality that has poured out of them and hearing you speak about your insights and your respective practices, being encouraged and feeling nourished from this conversation. And so, because I hope that we also will make sure that we can bear fruit in some ways, right? I want to leave those listening with your words, with your poetry, so that they can go out into the world and create for themselves, to really sit with the conversation that has unfolded, that has bloomed, but also be inspired and encouraged. And so I would love to close out on your poetry, and then we will invite Amanda Johnston back to close us off, who, of course, is the founding director of Torch Literary Arts.
You want to go first, or no? Or do
Yes,
you?
yes, I'll go.
Okay.
And I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you to the ASL translators. Thank you so much to the people and all the folks pouring into us in the listening audience. And thanks again to Wintergreen, to Torch, and my sister Malika. This is Water Prayer, Omi Adra. We are standing at the shore. It could be Adelaide, First Free Village, Salvador, or Varadero, Ferry Hill, or anywhere the Caribbean reaches for the sorrowful Atlantic. Our faces turn up to receive the sharp caresses of the wind. We fill our nostrils with salted air and walk into waves breaking gently at our ankles. Hand in hand and slowly swaying our bodies into the uprising of the sea, we step over sea stars and urchin, follow the path of conch and spirit, life force of our ancestors. She pulls us, swirls around, we sink ourselves down to our necks, water across our shoulders, washing us and lapping up to kiss our lips. We submerge, wash our torn selves clean and new, cry out to all our mothers, to Yemanja, we are her children too, like fish feeding all directions.
Thank you. That is so beautiful. I'd like to thank everybody for making today possible. I love speaking to Shauna. I love Shauna so much. I met her at Furious Flower, and we just broke bread with each other the other day and ate in a Caribbean restaurant and chatted. So thank you, Torch. Thank you, Wintergreen Writers. And Carmin, you're sublime. Thank you. And thank you for the ASL translators as well. So I'm going to read Jesus in the Wilderness. One, temptation. I know you were weary those 40 days in the wilderness. What was that wilderness like? Dry dust and swirling wind? No color, as the devil's flowers do not give birth to seeds here? What is it to live in the forest of a devil's yarn, like a wild goat yearning, tempted, strong of will, yet weak of mind? What is it to want? What is temptation but yielding of flesh? How fast did your heart beat against ribcage in anger at these tantalizing, abominable lies? No one talks about limbs weakening, or rats gnawing your belly, or lice in your hair like in the belly of the ship. No one speaks about that. To bill a saint, one needs to gloss over the body's ordinariness. One needs to forget there is mess and nastiness in the gut, the dry throat swallowing saliva, the ache of spit sliding along the cracked lips and down your neck back, the way the stomach contracts, its punch all uneven, each like a XXX of fists. 2. How not to drown in desire. They stretch like a bending river. They stretched and curled like a meandering river. And when the days began to stretch, and when his days began to curl, and when his days became a meandering river, its undertow dragging him. When the days became deceptive, a river meandering its undertow. When his days became a meandering river, when his days began to curl into a river, when his days stretched and curled, when his days stretched, curling into a river, whose undertow dragged him weary to the surface. 3. Sufferation. When his days stretched, curling into a river, whose undertow ripped his skin right to the soul. He who believed stood firm in dry dust, where flowers do not give birth from seeds, where wild goats stroll. No one talks of his trembling limbs, the gnawing rats in his gut, the fleas congregated to party in his hair. No one talks of the reptile's gopher as the devil sucked succulent orange over 40 days and nights, while he who believed stitched, then unpicked the stitches from his bloody lips. How the taunt of the orange juice ached his neck back in the ripe stench of the boat's belly. How they gripe, the dry heaves scraping his neck's back, his belly swelling pregnant with emptiness. And since those days, we fast in our thirst for salvation, long forgotten the bloodied scar on his nailed palm. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. Thank you again to our ASL interpreters. Thank you for all of you who have joined us today. We hope that you feel inspired and nourished, that you continue to create. I'm going to invite back Amanda Johnston, who will talk to you a little bit more about how you can continue to support Torch Literary Arts and the Wintergreen Women Writers Collective and all the Black women writers in your life. Thank you again.
Hello, everyone. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that incredible experience. I am overjoyed with emotion. This has been such a church, a calling, a gathering, and to connect us across the diaspora, wherever you are viewing this, wherever you are joining this. I'm so grateful that we are able to make this space for us to be in community with each other and hear from each other, especially now more than ever. Thank you so much. For those of you who don't know, my name is Amanda Johnston. I am the founder and executive director of Torch Literary Arts. Thank you so much for joining us today for this installment of the Welcome Table Talk that we produce in partnership with the Wintergreen Women Writers Collective. Thank you so much, Shauna, Malika, and Carmin for this incredible conversation. And of course, thank you to our ASL interpreters, Chennai and Destiny, for making this program more accessible to our community. We have so much more coming up in store for you. And from Torch, I want to invite you all to join us at our 20th anniversary celebration, a gathering of flames that will be taking place in Austin, Texas this September 25th through the 27th. Many of our Wintergreen sisters will be there in community with us, and several will be sharing and participating as part of our featured lineup. We will have headliners including Patricia Smith, Rachel Eliza Griffiths. We will have Sharon Bridgeforth and Crystal Wilkinson and several others joining us to present, read, fellowship, and come together to celebrate 20 years of Torch amplifying Black women writers. That is open for anyone to register and join us. Tickets are available on our website at torchliteraryarts.org. And that is it for our gathering today. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon and rest of your day. Please do check the links that have been saved in the chat. Visit Wintergreen Women Writers Collective to learn more about their programs. Visit torchliteraryarts.org. Of course, follow these amazing writers and learn more about their work. Discover more poems than the incredible ones you heard just today. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Be well, y'all. Blessings.
Thank you.